Buenos días, buenas tardes y buenas noches. Gracias por conectarse a este webinar sobre la deuda interna. Lo hemos denominado Gestión de la deuda interna, tendencias actuales y posibles repercusiones en los países del sur global. Y es que se ha dado un crecimiento de la deuda pública interna, sobre todo en las últimas 2 décadas en los países del sur. Muchos están más familiarizados, sobre todo con la deuda interna y la crisis y las crisis que la deuda externa ha desencadenado, sobre todo en América Latina también. Sin embargo, una mirada a la deuda pública total nos puede dar más elementos para tener un análisis completo sobre la situación real del endeudamiento y sus riesgos en nuestros países. En esta oportunidad vamos a hablar sobre qué es la deuda interna, en qué consiste, cuáles son sus conceptos, de dónde viene. También vamos a ver cuál es su relación con la deuda externa en términos de comparación, de proporciones. Vamos a conversar también sobre cuál es cómo sería parte de los análisis de sostenibilidad de la deuda, cómo es actualmente, cómo debería ser, qué experiencias hay. Y vamos a conversar también sobre casos emblemáticos que han puesto a la deuda interna, que si bien en las últimas 2 décadas principalmente viene creciendo, vamos a hablar de 2 casos que son el caso de Argentina y el caso de Sri Lanka, que han puesto el tema en la agenda inclusive de organismos financieros internacionales y de analistas en general. Finalmente, esta es una oportunidad también para que Latindadd pueda presentar su más reciente reporte sobre deuda, que hace un análisis específico sobre la situación de la deuda interna en América Latina. Entonces, les recuerdo que tenemos traducción español-inglés en la parte inferior de sus pantallas. Pueden seleccionar el idioma de su preferencia. Vamos a tener un formato de webinar con presentaciones realizadas por cada uno de nuestros 4 panelistas y posteriormente tendremos un espacio para preguntas. Sin más preámbulo, voy a presentar a nuestros panelistas y comienzo por presentarme yo. Para quienes no me conocen, soy Patricia Miranda, soy la directora de Incidencia Global y coordinadora de Nueva Arquitectura Financiera en Latindadd, y nuevamente sean todas y todos bienvenidos. Tenemos un panel con especialistas y expertos que nos van a llevar nos van a conducir en este webinar sobre todos estos temas relacionados a la deuda interna. Vamos a contar con la presencia de Daniela Berdeja. Daniela es analista de deuda en Nueva Arquitectura Financiera en Latindadd y también es responsable del Atlas de Vulnerabilidades para América Latina y el Caribe, que ustedes pueden encontrar en la página web de Latindadd. Daniela se especializa en la investigación y sobre desarrollo económico y políticas de financiamiento y deuda, también realizando vínculos con género y austeridad. Vamos a contar también con Maia Colodenco. Maia tiene una amplia experiencia en relaciones financieras internacionales y en distintos foros y organismos multilaterales de crédito. Maia ha sido jefa de la Unidad de Asuntos Internacionales del Ministerio de Economía de Argentina y ha representado a Argentina en el G20 en distintos roles y funciones. Actualmente es directora de iniciativas globales en Suramericana Visión. Tenemos también el gusto de contar con Ahilan Kadirgamar. Ahilan es profesor titular del Departamento de Sociología de la Universidad de Jaffna en Sri Lanka y tiene una experiencia en investigación en temas de cambio agrario, cooperativas, alternativas económicas y en general sobre la economía política de Sri Lanka. Bienvenido, Ahilan. Y finalmente tenemos a Matthew Martin. Matthew es director de Development Finance International. Lleva más de 20 años asesorando a países en desarrollo, organizaciones internacionales y donantes en materia de financiación del desarrollo y deuda. Muchas gracias a los cuatro por estar aquí. Tenemos un panel brillante y sin más preámbulo vamos a dar inicio a las presentaciones para empezar a tener más insumos, más contenidos sobre la situación de la deuda interna. Voy a comenzar invitando a Daniela Berdeja de Latindadd. Daniela nos va a presentar este reporte que estamos lanzando desde Latindadd sobre deuda interna. Daniela, ¿cuáles han sido las principales dinámicas que encuentras, los principales hallazgos en este reporte? Y también nos gustaría que nos puedas mencionar si el endeudamiento interno es una mejor alternativa o no para financiar nuestros presupuestos, los presupuestos nacionales en nuestros países. ¿Qué consideraciones son importantes en términos del manejo y la gestión de la deuda interna? ¿Y cuál es la posición que podrías compartir desde sociedad civil respecto a este tema? Gracias, Daniela. Adelante, por favor.
Gracias, Patricia. Buen día, buenas tardes o buenas noches a todos y todas quienes nos acompañan hoy. Voy a comenzar compartiendo mi pantalla para introducir un poco lo que Patricia venía diciendo, los contenidos y lo que hemos abordado desde el último informe de Latindadd, en este caso sobre la deuda interna, y así como igual lo mencionaba Patricia, nos hemos preguntado si este endeudamiento es, digamos, la mejor alternativa de financiamiento para nuestros países, esto hablando desde una mirada de América Latina, ¿no? El reporte tiene tres grandes partes. Voy a intentar abordarlas en esta presentación, sé que el tiempo es limitado, pero voy a detenerme quizás en algunos puntos que me parecen más relevantes para la discusión del día de hoy. Entonces,
So there they are, the contents. The main content that I'm going to address, the first one, the first aspect has to do with the more introductory part, characterizing debt for domestic debt for particularly for middle income countries, the various dynamics, and some considerations for sustainability and restructuring. The second part of the report has to do with an analysis of the data on the burden and the growth of this domestic debt. And then we ground it on four cases that are countries that have the highest levels of domestic debt in the region, that are Brazil. We have Maia here to talk about it. Brazil, Colombia, Costa Rica. And if time allows, I'll show some brushstrokes about that. And then the conclusions, recommendations of the report. So, starting with the first item, it seems like starting the pandemic and the growth that was already showing an upward trend, general debt, both private and public, but after the pandemic, though this, even though there was already an increase, there seems to have been a further increase. So many of these have happened both in middle income countries as well as lower income countries, which is a sort of mechanism that is a G20. We're going under the G20 framework, which is being implemented by the World Bank, as well as outside this framework that we'll see in the panel. So stemming from these restructurings and with the IMF roles, that we have some cases have led to restructuring, not just of external debt, which was the most pressing issue, but it was also domestic debt. In fact, in the last papers from the IMF and different forums, it has been labeled as an issue that attention needs to be paid to, but it's not a new issue. And in the region, it's a source of financing that is being used more and more. After the debt condoning processes in the 80s, the lost decade, as they call it, after the 90s, and multilateral forgiveness of debt, countries in Latin America begin to focus on developing and growing national debt markets. So this is an important aspect to understand, that instruments have also diversified, and the use given to them is given more frequently to these. It's also true that the composition of creditors has diversified, but we have now we don't have clarity on the limits, the bounds of internal debt, just like of domestic debt. Just like as in the case of external debt, there's also a growth of private creditors in this kind of debt, but it could be the residents who fall within or outside the country, who can have bonds in national or foreign currency, and operations can be agreed upon under the national legal framework, meaning if these bonds were acquired internally, or maybe they were acquired internationally. So it's important to address some issues concerning definition of internal debt itself. Broadly speaking, there are three great ways to create larger ways to do it. One, to do through currency, currency. The other one has to do with residence of the creditor, and third has to do with the regulations ruling this. And this goes hand in hand with the market where this debt was issued or emitted. So here we show only that middle income, lower and upper middle income countries, what criteria do they use for this? May not be that they use just one solution, and they may use more than one. Maybe the lower middle income countries use a currency to differentiate this kind of debt, and the medium middle income countries use this just to get an idea to get some clarity on how it's defined. Either way, there are some factors such as the guides that countries use and the like. But it is important to understand that for middle income countries, particularly those with access to markets, decisions to acquire debt have to do with choices between costs, the various currencies, different externalities or risks that could have an influence in the future. And these choices become more difficult in the sense that in the region, large part of the countries don't have access to financing. So in the literature, the main trade-offs, or these dichotomies, as we call them, as far as decisions for acquiring debt, these are a trade-off between the currency and the cost. So issuing in domestic currency can imply lower performance timeframes, and more relevant as the trade-off between risk and cost is a big deal. So to issue debt under the legislation and jurisdiction for national with the nation is safer for states issuing the debt, but because it's verified as verified in evidence in the literature, it tends to be more costly to issue this debt this way. So you have management of debt, and it tends to look into these factors as well. Now, to clarify, and maybe just to give you more on this issue of cost versus risk, when one looks at the makeup of total public debt and divides it between internal and external, internal represents 49% and external 51%. So it's almost 50-50. But when you do the same ratio for debt, for serving the debt, the proportion tends to be usually the service of domestic debt, and you see that even the relationship is 50-50 for domestic debt, the burden tends to be higher. So in the document, we try to address some aspects of current market dynamics for national debt, and I'm going to show a little graph on that. But there has been a growth of issuance of debt in national currency. I already mentioned a lot of the risks, but here we can rescue some aspects that may be positive. So, for example, it is an alternative for financing, for public financing, that is considered to be safer, and in turn, this has special connotations for countries in the region that, as I was saying, don't have, for those countries that, like I said, don't have access to these markets and to this financing. And the other aspect has to do with shocks or crisis resistance, such as the pandemic, where situations in which states, in having a more developed local national currency market, can rely on that financing to respond more effectively to these crises. In the case of Latin America, there is a positive correlation on average between, say, the size of fiscal packages that were carried out during the pandemic and overall indebtedness. So this can local indebtedness. So it shows that it is an alternative for countries and it is safer in being usually run back, managed by or subject to national legislation. This was carried out with information from the IDB, where we can see different groups of countries and we compare different decades, and we see that the issuance of debt in local currency has increased in all decades in all groups of countries. Maybe in the larger and more diversified economies, this may become more evident. Now, going over to sustainability considerations that we address in the document. I'm not going to go too in-depth into that because we'll be addressing this throughout the panel, but I do think it's important to highlight three aspects. Now, the first, the IMF, which is the institution that creates this analysis of debt that are usually the most accepted analyses as far as guides or for policies, fiscal and indebtedness policy, has two large frameworks, and these are explained in the report. One for lower income countries, for lower middle income countries, and one for those that have access to markets. This second one for those who have access to markets that has been reviewed in 2022, and there has been a new framework, a broader framework. This changes name. It's got a more complex methodology. But what I would like to salvage from this is that that the debt has been incorporated, but in the overall portfolio for public debt. So, like if you look at the range with regard to GDP and also gross financial, we have it in Spanish and English there, but you have seen progress in incorporating domestic debt, but it doesn't necessarily mean that it's positive when you're including it in an aggregate way like this. And I think that we will see this in the case of Sri Lanka, for example, that when you go into a process of restructuring, this can also play against you. And now looking at some indicators within the framework of sustainability for lower income countries, you have it can be used as a parameter to determine whether it's sustainable, non-sustainable, or risky. So, and in the cases with countries with access to markets, with no access to markets, it's not just there's a series of tests and other appraisals that can be used to assess risk, but it's also important to point out that there are other indicators and other criteria that are used or have been used in the region. One of these is during the stage for debt forgiveness for countries with more debt, you use total debt ratios. So it would include domestic debt, but there's some work from Johnson in 2001 that makes a calculation looking only at domestic debt after these processes of debt forgiveness, and calculates a range between 20 and 25% of GDP in order to consider domestic debt as not sustainable. Then the Andean Community of Nations, through its convergence programs, has set forth a ratio of 50% of GDP, but for total public debt. So maybe there isn't yet that breakdown of domestic debt that we think it would be interesting and important to do, and we consider that in these analyses of sustainability, they should include domestic debt, but in a differentiated way with its own indicators and parameters, because the way it's treated and its management are different than the way you manage external debt. As I was saying, that this may be clarified further with the case of Sri Lanka. Now, these analyses are the key instrument in order for restructuring processes, definitions as to how much the debt should be reduced by, and subsequent policies stemming from these processes. So what I can salvage from this is that what I can point out here, I know I have a few minutes left, but just to say that domestic debt can be restructured independently and managed in a sovereign way, but the effects of this restructuring will depend on the makeup of the creditors, meaning who have domestic debt in their hands in this country. If are they financial institutions, for example? Are they foreign investors that have meant an increase in the, or if it's pension funds, where at the end of the day, effects will have repercussions on retirees. So repercussions will depend a lot on the makeup of the creditors. But it is true that, as was mentioned in the most recent restructurings, that there has been an important role played by the IMF and that has, where it has pushed to have restructuring of the debt be that of total debt, meaning it should include domestic debt, but it doesn't mean that domestic debt required restructuring necessarily. So maybe for that reason, in sustainability analysis for debt, we think that the treatment should be done in a differentiated way. So once again, I think that that's why Sri Lanka is an emblematic case, and we are probably going to also touch on that when we look at the case of this country. And obviously, among other issues, we have the role of the IMF and austerity measures that I think we all know about. Given that I have little time left, I just wanted to quickly show you two general graphs from the region and then go on to closing points. In these two graphs, what we want to show is, on the one hand, on the graph to the left, the growth of public domestic debt. So how was it doing at the end of the 90s, and the blue bars, what it was like, what the debt was like roughly in 2010, where we were still within the boom era in the region, and the latest available information that we have. So orange would be the level of domestic debt current by GDP percentage, and so you see, and so 12 years would be blue, and then you can see the different countries. This has increased, and it's Brazil, Argentina, Costa Rica, and Colombia in the document are the countries that have maybe the higher debt. Here we have, for example, Bolivia, Mexico as the other countries where we could look to. And on the right, we have these ratios between domestic debt in blue and external debt, so in orange. So in some countries you see a preponderance of external debt, but in others it's rather domestic debt, so as we said. So but in the average regionally, it's almost like 50-50, the relationship, and this has been increasing because the relationship was, before there was greater weight of foreign debt now. And what I had already mentioned at the beginning was so you have higher burden for domestic debt because it means higher costs. So orange bars there, you see they're much more dominant than the blue ones. And in this case, these payments due to debt restrict the available fiscal space and the capacity to push public policy. So given that we're in a high interest environment, this also becomes more complicated, and bearing in mind that our countries, once again, if they have access to international markets, and I mean, even in internal markets, you're going to have higher interest. So this puts us in a more difficult situation to manage, also in a context of increasing needs. So we're surely going to be sharing this presentation. There's some information on Brazil here, some just a little information on Colombia and Costa Rica that I would have liked to have shared, but alas, I don't know if we have time, we can always go back to it, and I'll go on to key messages that I was able to extract four from the document. You can find some other additional points in the documents. The first one is that although the internal debt is more frequent and could be considered, in addition to safer, is faster and has fewer obstacles, if you want to call them administrative, because they are not necessarily ones that require approvals. Sometimes in some countries they do, but we also have to take into account that it also entails some risks as far as cost conditions. And so, for example, we have some positive aspects, but also taking some risks into consideration. Then it's also important to have transparency for two reasons. On the one hand, because it can allow for more responsible debt management. And also, it's not just transparency when it comes to how much it costs, what is the term, who is owed what, but also why are we acquiring debt? Like, where are we directing these resources? Where it's information that we have to get, for example, for countries that we've analyzed. And then the second reason has to do with this demand for incorporating internal debt in a clear, differentiated way, but it doesn't mean that it has to necessarily be incorporated into IMF frameworks, where it would be good to incorporate them, but countries themselves can also carry out this analysis, and it's for that reason that it's important to increase transparency and the quality of data available. And lastly, well, this is an issue that I didn't touch on much because we're going to look at it up next, but in addition to the consequences of internal debt restructuring, depending, like I said, of the creditors, this process, if it's part of agreements with the IMF, in addition, on top of the effects of restructuring of internal debt, you have other aspects that affect austerity measures. So it undermines the crisis that it's trying to get out of. So with that, I will close, and I think you shared some of the documents in the chat, but you can also find it at the Latindadd website. Thank you very much. Thank you, Daniela, for this presentation. Says Patricia, indeed, we have the links in the chat so that you can have access to our reports, both in Spanish as well as in English. Thank you for sharing these findings, Daniela, and from that, we will be talking about these issues during the webinar. And now you've mentioned several countries. We have a few cases of some countries. We have some examples in this report. And at this time, we're going to go in depth into the case of Argentina. Argentina with Maia Colodenco. Maia, you've been part of the Ministry of the Economy at the time of restructuring of the debt, both domestic as well as foreign. Argentina first placed its bets on renegotiating the net with its internal bond holders. So we'd like for you to tell us what is in your reading of the situation for Argentina's domestic debt, like what was it like before and after this restructuring of bonds? What were the chief instruments used, including laws, regulations? What was the strategy used by the Argentine government and at that time? And also, what was the role of the IMF? Because it was a time. It was the first time where this issue was put into the agenda in a more international context for our country. So, what lessons were learned from the case of Argentina? Go ahead, Maya. Well, thank you for the invitation, says Maya. Thank you also for this report that seems very timely. And I mean, I could, from the outset, I could say that it's an issue that it hasn't been that explored. So international financial architecture it's a topic that has become relevant and that is associated to change in the scenario of international debt architecture. This change is mentioned by the report, how the context of creditors has changed. In the past, you would face, as a country, you'd be faced with restructuring if necessary with multilateral creditors, and now increasingly you have private creditors, and these private creditors don't just hold foreign currency under foreign law bonds, but these private creditors also have, they may be private, resident, non-resident, but there's been a big mixture of the parameter of debt holders, and the way of issuing debt has changed a lot too, and this has new challenges, poses new challenges, and these challenges are increased also for the person, for the institution managing the debt, for the institution tasked with for example, before the war in Ukraine and COVID, where the rates were low in the market, many countries have gone out to finance lower rates than they would usually do outside, and facing different kinds of unknown indebtedness, unknown as far as how to deal with them, the risk they might suppose, and especially when these conditions changed, markets become more expensive and financial conditions change suddenly. Many countries were faced with a context of greater challenges, higher costs, difficult to understand what kind of debt and who they should negotiate those restructurings with. We saw that in different countries in Africa as part also of debt. So that just to sort of go more in depth into how this new space changes conditions and poses new challenges, but particularly it's about understanding the risks that it means to issue in a different currency vis-a-vis internal debt. So it's important to understand for anyone managing this debt, and to understand what is domestic debt, to have a clear definition. I mean, again, in the report you mentioned, it's fundamental. It's fundamental to understand. We talk about local currency, local legislation. Are we talking about residency? Like what we need to, it's important to define this parameter. So that's basically like an introduction that I think is important to highlight, and to understand the risks is crucial. In the case of Argentina, I'm going to talk a little bit about the context in which we were in 2019 as far as debt in Argentina, and then talk to you a little bit about some lessons learned. We're going to talk both internal as well as foreign debt, and also the restructurings that we put into play. Toward 2019, the debt was unpayable, non-financeable. By December of 2019, the national government was facing this situation, with the public debt going from 52.6% to 90.2% by the end of 2019. 77.82% of that was in foreign currencies. So that this solution of debt that was impossible to finance and non-sustainable required a comprehensive approach, and we're going to show you solutions both for those issued for that as well as for local. So we expanded a simultaneous strategy that aimed to face all fronts, both internal as well as foreign debt. And it's worth mentioning that these negotiations were carried out in adverse circumstances, mid-COVID. So the initial diagnosis that I mentioned was December 2009. By March 2020, we were already facing the worst time in the pandemic, with negotiations that should have been done, that had to be done over Zoom instead of being able to do them in person. Argentina had a unique sequence that, as was mentioned a little before, like Patricia mentioned, it wasn't that it was like capriciously unique. It's just that it had to do with the way that the debt, the terms of the debt. So we started to restructure. The structuring of the debt started with the debt with the private sector in dollars, issued under the day rate local foreign, and so, but Argentina decided that would be the parameter for the debt, and the currency, so under local and foreign laws. So then we went to the IMF under it was the 44 billion that had requested in 2008 that were approved, and so that was, and then the three chief goals that the government had were to restore sustainability, to minimize litigation, and to strengthen the domestic capitals market. Argentina also, we also asked the IMF we didn't start with the IMF. You don't restructure the debt. You change the term, and then we requested some extensions. But prior to that, we requested, and this is something that is also good is to know, and it's something that the IMF did jointly by request of the government. The government carried out its own sustainability analysis, and likewise, the IMF carried out one outside the program for the country, and this was an anchor to help with private creditors that the IMF also have declared that the debt in that Argentinian context was not sustainable with a high probability. So within this process, we began a process of recovering the debt market because the previous government had reprofiled and had done a measure, had taken a measure without precedent of defaulting. So when the government began in 2009, we began with a process of recovering the debt market in pesos to soften the curve. We also worked very strongly with part of the instruments we used with the Congress and different actors. I think this is important for a healthy restructuring process for debt. We presented the sustainability of public debt law under foreign law, also the law for sustainability in bond, another law for strengthening of sustainability of public debt. Likewise, law 27,178 that talks about the program for extended feasibility. So, for example, Argentina for the first time discussed this program with the IMF involving all actors. It's also worth mentioning that this whole process and all these laws and all of the measures that were being adopted and the communications were uploaded to the Ministry of the Economy's website in order to guarantee full transparency. Briefly, just another comment here on the case of domestic debt in Argentina. The country contemplated domestic debt as debt issued under Argentinian laws, be it foreign or local currency. But in the process of restructuring, Argentina defined this perimeter that was going to be restructured, but it was in foreign currency, in dollars, and this to reduce exchange risk and obviously accompanying and rebuilding the capital market. So one important thing was that Argentina was growing from year 2000, notably because Argentina also at that time had also undergone a debt restructuring program in 2003, and then domestic debt for Argentina became a very important source of financing, given that for a very long time we had limited access to the capitals market. So domestic debt in that context, working with the central bank, pension fund managers, these have been key stakeholders in building this market, but also in the increase of the debt in pesos. Challenges with regard to domestic debt in Argentina, especially when it comes to dollars, the elevated exposure to exchange risk, which is part of this debt issued in dollars, is a high concentration of short-term expiration, having exposure to public financing, that's refinancing, elevated financial costs because we face high interest rates in order to place bonds. So we need to take these challenges into account and manage them among other risks and challenges. So some lessons learned that I would like to mention, of course, obviously we can exchange later, but it is utterly important, interesting for debt issuers, for proper management of debt as contemplated as public policy, because obviously it entails a decision for governments, the financing development with debt or financing development under other forms of financing. And so they decided when you decide to use debt, it's very important to understand the the implications of acquiring debt in local currency, foreign currency, foreign laws. It's not trivial. I mean, even if it may seem trivial, just to there's a difference between having debt under local law or foreign law, and also interest rates. These inherent risks are, it's very important to understand them for proper management of debt, because you may even get to avoid disorderly restructurings in the future. Then, the ex post definition, in the case you do have to restructure debt, it's important to come up with the definition of the perimeter, like what debt is going to be restructured, why. For example, Argentina, why does Argentina treat, like, it's important to understand why Argentina treats pesos debt differently. So it's important to understand what who the stakeholders are. These are stakeholders in the case of Argentina, debt holding in local currency. This internal debt is very associated with economic activity. So this sort of restructuring can also affect economic activity. So it's also about defining stakeholders involved in the perimeter of what's being restructured, and to come up with the proper treatment for it is very important. Another lesson learned from the Argentina case is that involving all stakeholders is very important as well. It's important to understand that the Congress plays a role, different political sectors play a role, but the laws established and defined in the Congress provide legitimacy to restructurings being carried out. And of course, obviously, the IMF is a key stakeholder in this case. Argentina has sat down with a vision of having a program that is adequate and more importantly, sustainable for the population, and to have it be. So when we renegotiate the program in 2022, to also have agreed upon principles, but also it's about understanding what kind of institution the IMF is, to having carried out the sustainability analysis, this analysis of debt, but IMF prior to private entity analysis. And so it was important. And one thing that they mentioned was that countries needed to be able to improve their ability to carry out this analysis. It's crucial in order to improve debt management in our countries, because it allows improving even the capability to negotiate. Another lesson learned is that transparency and the proper registration, like record keeping, like Argentina said, it's always been as transparent as possible. Obviously, it's a negotiation, but all definitions, agreements that can be published are published in due time and form. Records of debt, also important to keep that information. It's relevant, and to understand that this we were mentioning about, debt entails definitions related to debt, or choosing to finance development with debt. It entails a risk and a conflict with regard to risk reduction. So this idea of matching, so it needs to be understood that not paying other fiscal requirements in order to pay for the debt is going to affect the country, and it's going to affect democracy. So I think that in that sense, the report is very relevant, and it allows us to have a broad discussion on these aspects. So that basically, thank you very much. I always here attentive to any kind of discussion on the topic. Thank you very much, Maya. And we can see how it's not that simple. This internal debt is related to the reality of every country. It's very important how you define the perimeter, and also to identify the various stakeholders, the impact on local, national economic activity, and impact on the population as well. And this leads me to, or it's a segue to allow our next panelist. We are going to switch from Spanish to English at this time.
Thanks, Ahilan, for joining us today. You have been very active in analyzing the debt restructuring, the domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka. So we can see that there are several commonalities when we talk about debt problems in southern countries, in Latin America, Africa, Asia. So since the case of Sri Lanka has been an important case that has put again the domestic debt in the global agenda, I would like to ask you what has been the experience of the domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka? What instruments have been used? You just heard what Maia mentioned about Argentina. And why was a domestic debt restructuring necessary in Sri Lanka? In addition, if you can also mention what are the main economic and social impacts of this, and what are the short and medium-term perspectives for Sri Lanka in this case. And again, if you can share with us what was the role of the IMF and lessons learned from Sri Lanka that we can take for the Global South. So thanks, Ahilan. Again, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Patricia, and thank you to the organizers for inviting me. I think this kind of exchange is extremely important, and solidarity between Asia and Latin America on these kinds of issues are very important. So thank you again. As you know, Sri Lanka is going through its worst economic crisis since independence. Our economy has possibly shrunk by as much as 20% over the last number of years. And it is in that context, 2 years ago, in April 2022, Sri Lanka defaulted on its external debt. It did not default on its domestic debt. It defaulted on its external debt. And we went to an IMF program and we started a process of trying to restructure our debt. Now, going to the IMF, they had two demands. One, that we should achieve a primary budget surplus, and two, that we should move forward on debt restructuring. What they meant was external debt restructuring. But there is a very insidious way in which the IMF works. While the IMF claims that they do not take a position on domestic debt restructuring, their debt sustainability analysis, which required that Sri Lanka's total debt, domestic debt and external debt together, should be brought down from 128% to 95%. That is one target, that the total debt should be 95%. But our haircut is such that our gross financing needs, our external gross financing needs, have to be only reduced to 4.5%. If you are to reduce our external GFN by 4.5%, but our total GFN, our total gross financing needs, domestic and external, should be 13%. Now, to bring this down, it required domestic debt restructuring. So while they say they don't take a position on domestic debt restructuring, if you look at their DSA, Sri Lanka needed to do about 1.6% of GDP reduction every year for the next 16 years in domestic debt restructuring. In other words, every year a reduction of 1.6% of GDP in domestic debt GFN, right? So we were forced into domestic debt restructuring. That is what is there in the IMF's DSA. So it is very insidious. On the one hand, they say they don't take a position on domestic debt restructuring, but their debt sustainability analysis and the way in which they created the GFN meant that Sri Lanka had to go through domestic debt restructuring. The second part to the reason why this was pushed through is that Sri Lanka's external bondholders put pressure saying that they want Sri Lanka to go through domestic debt restructuring. Otherwise, that they would not do the external debt restructuring. So it was pressure from the bondholders and the IMF that led to Sri Lanka restructuring its debt. Our analysis of the IMF's DSA is that the DSA itself is created in the interest of Sri Lanka's external creditors. That is why there is such a small haircut, and we are continuing to going to have a GFN of 4.5% of GDP for external debt. In other words, 30% of our revenue, 30% of our budget, even after the IMF program, is going to be towards external debt servicing. So we have not reduced our debt. There won't be an adequate haircut. And so this program is probably going to fail. But in the meantime, because of this pressure, and because our government, our regime in power wants to please the IMF and wants to please the creditors, they went through domestic debt restructuring. Now, how did that domestic debt restructuring happen, right? Approximately about 50% of our debt is domestic debt. There are large number of banks, finance companies, individual investors that own this domestic debt. And of course, the central bank also holds a substantial amount of this domestic debt. Now, because of the IMF DSA and the GFN requirement, we have to reduce every year about 1.6% of GDP in domestic debt servicing. Of that, 1% was going to be by the central bank, which is not a problem because the government can always capitalize the central bank. 0.1% of GDP was for foreign exchange debt, foreign debt in domestic law, because we only hold a very little amount of foreign debt under domestic law. And they said, okay, if you're going to restructure external debt in foreign currency debt, this is also a demand of the bondholders, external bondholders. So it's 0.1% is there. They did not touch the banks. They did not touch the finance companies. They did not even touch the big individual investors in domestic debt. What they did was they decided to go after the retirement funds, because in Sri Lanka, all formal sector workers, even formal sector workers who earn below poverty level wages, have to compulsorily contribute towards retirement funds, so that when they retire, they have an employee provident fund. It is that fund, so tea pluckers, garment workers, the most lowest paid private sector workers, their fund amounting to about 4 trillion Sri Lankan rupees was subject to domestic debt restructuring, so that every year 0.5% GDP equivalent of that retirement fund was going to be reduced every year for 16 years, 0.5% equivalent of GDP. So the total, if you look at the current level of this total retirement funds, it is about 17% of GDP. So in 16 years, that is going to come to about, it is going to reduce about 8% of GDP. So it's going to come down to 9% of GDP. In other words, according to my calculations, the retirement funds are going to reduce by about 47%. So the opportunity cost to the workers, if a worker is going to be working for the next 16 years, if they didn't go through domestic debt restructuring, versus when they go through domestic debt restructuring, their retirement fund is going to be 47% less. And these are the most hardest working people in the country who earn the wealth of this country, whereas the wealthy people will not even suffer 1 rupee through this domestic debt restructuring. So this is an extremely unjust process. So this is what people are going through. And keep in mind, if you look at the retirement funds, in 2022, around the time we defaulted, the Sri Lankan rupee devalued from 200 rupees to $1 to 360 rupees to $1. So already the real value of these retirement funds, if you look at it in dollar terms, had declined by anywhere from 40 to 30%. So this is DDR on top of the impact of this inflationary reduction in the retirement funds, right? So they're being slammed twice to make these retirement funds almost worthless. So why is this happening, right? And I think this is the other really insidious way in which IMF programs work, because they are bringing about austerity, right? Already real wages of people who are working now are down 40% because of the high inflation that came with the devaluation of the rupee. Then their future earnings are also coming down. Government subsidies have been completely cut. Market pricing of energy, market pricing of all kinds of inputs for agriculture. So all of this has also had a tremendous impact of affecting the working people. And on top of that, this domestic debt restructuring. And all of this means that suddenly the rupee is strengthening. I told you that the rupee had devalued to 360 rupees to $1. Now it's back to 290 rupees to $1. Why are they doing that? So that Sri Lanka can repay its creditors. So it makes it much more creditor friendly. All of this process is towards repaying Sri Lanka's external creditors. So I will end with, what should the Sri Lankan people do now? Sri Lanka is looking at an election in a few months, our presidential election, parliamentary elections next year. The way in which this domestic debt restructuring happened is that the central bank proposed this domestic debt restructuring proposal. These retirement funds were managed by the monetary board of the central bank. So the central bank proposes, the monetary board of the central bank accepts, who's the custodian of these retirement funds. They're supposed to think in the best interest of the retirement fund. So the government proposes and the government implements it against the working people. So now we need to have elections. We need to change the government. We need to make sure we refinance these retirement funds of the losses. So every year, this 0.5% of GDP worth that has already been cut has to be refinanced by the government. And that should be the election demand. And that is what we are starting to talk to the trade unions, to be able to redo the damage that the IMF, the external bondholders who are really predatory, and a complicit Sri Lankan elite and the government have carried through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ahilan, for that comprehensive presentation. And we can see what is the relationship between external and domestic debt, the pressure that Sri Lanka has received, and overall that when we talk about debt restructuring, we need to look at everything, not only one part of the debt. And this is an important example. But I think also this message about what is the impact, the social impact, the impact in this case on workers, the impact on pension funds. And this has a commonality because several countries in Latin America as well have a strong relationship between domestic debt and pension funds. So this gives me the precise floor to talk about debt sustainability. And I'm going to switch to Spanish to present Matthew Martin, Matthew will have a combination of English and Spanish. So I advise everyone to keep keep on with the translation selection that you have made.
Matthew, we've talked about how to incorporate domestic debt in debt sustainability analyses. Ahilan was mentioning that these analyses or these methodologies will nevertheless always focus on external debt, and this is a problem when it comes to thinking of a restructuring. Matthew, you've worked in you've done field work, to put it that way, in different countries in Latin America and in Africa with ministries of the economy, with central banks, and on how to restructure that, how to measure it, how to analyze sustainability more exhaustively, more completely. So what is the experience you could share with regard to introducing domestic debt in these processes, given the weight that they have on budgets with regard to external debt? And there's going to be a problem of liquidity, but also solvency. So could you do a balance on this for us? Thank you very much, Matthew. Go ahead, please.
Matthew, we can't hear you. Not yet.
There we go. Now I'm there. Yes, as you said, Patty, I'm going to do 2 languages because
Your mic is off again.
Thank you. Chaos. I'm going to present in 2 languages because my spoken Spanish is less good than my written Spanish, as Patty has experienced for many years in our long working relationship. And so I thought it would be easier to show the presentation in Spanish, which I'll do right now. And I hope that is visible on the screen. Is it visible as a presentation? Yes. But I'll speak in English. And let me just begin by saying thank you so much for what I think is an excellent report that Latindadd has produced on domestic debt in Latin America. And really, I think it's a very timely discussion because, as we've heard, given the interaction between external and domestic debt and the role of the IMF and external actors in dealing with domestic debt is a very important part of the international financial architecture and really ought to be much more strongly included also in the discussions on financing for development, which are happening in advance of the next Financing for Development conference. But I want to focus on 2 issues, as you said in your introductory remarks. One is, what's the scale of the domestic debt burden? And here I'm just going to show a few updated numbers from our Debt Service Watch database, which you also used in your Latindadd report, because we have a partnership to produce and use those different types of data on debt service. So for me, the most important burden of debt for the citizens of the countries and of the world is debt service. First of all, because if it's very high, it results in cuts in public spending. And those are particularly important, the social spending cuts and the environmental spending cuts, which would stop us from confronting the dual crises of inequality and the climate. And secondly, because if this service goes up a lot, that's the moment when people like the IMF arrive in countries, or sometimes countries decide to do it for themselves. They decide to take austerity measures, which means cuts in those services in order to reduce the future debt burden. So we felt about a year ago that it was really important to produce a new database in cooperation with Latindadd and a whole global network of civil society called Debt Service Watch, which includes, for the first time anywhere in the world, the domestic and external debt service at that stage it was 2023 for 144 countries of the global south, or and speaking as someone who comes from South Africa, we are increasingly calling ourselves the global majority because we represent the majority of the world's citizens. And that database was used in the Latindadd report. And I just want to say thank you for the team. I think some of them are on this call, notably David Waddock, who put those data together, and Maria Holloway as well. So what we've recently done, and the only reason I'm showing the numbers, is that we've recently prepared the numbers for 2024, which will be published in September. So just to show you a few very quick examples, this ratio of service to debt service to budget revenue has not changed a lot. In this graph, I'm showing that essentially it's more than 15% of revenue in 27 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it's more than 20% in 20 of them, and the average regional level is 33%, so it's very high. And then within that, for the domestic versus external service, I've split the countries in Latin America into two groups, the if you like, mainland Latin America ones and the Caribbean. And as Daniela already said, the service is much higher on domestic debt because of high interest rates. And in 11 of 16 Latin American mainland countries, the service of internal debt is more than half the total debt service. You can see the red part of the graph. And in the Caribbean, it's roughly the same. It's 8 of 14 countries in the Caribbean, slightly lower proportion, but still a very important part of the debt burden. We also have been looking a bit at the other regions of the world, in case you just think this is a problem confined to Latin America, and how this matches the different types of social spending and so on. And effectively, in Latin America and the Caribbean, not only is it absorbing a high proportion of budget revenue, but it's also absorbing about 30% of the budget spending going into debt service. And that's 1.5 times the spending on education, 1.7 times the spending on health, and more than twice as much as is being spent on social protection. And that means that essentially the domestic debt service is about 20% of total spending in the budget. And if you look at the indicators for Latin America and the Caribbean and compare them with the averages of other countries in the global south, the burden for Latin America is either roughly the same or even higher. It's higher in Latin America than probably all the other regions in the world, except for Africa, where it's still higher. And in 2024, with the latest numbers we've got, we see roughly the same level. In other words, there's been no reduction as part of the recovery post-COVID, if there is such a thing. And also we see forecasts going through to 2030, which show that this high level of debt service will continue throughout the period of the SDGs and Agenda 2030. So that's just to show that how heavy the burden is of domestic debt service on countries. What can we do about it? So I think there are, first of all, as people have already said in previous presentations, you really need to look at the context of each country. But there are some common lessons that we can learn across the world. And as Patty said, we've spent the last 30 years working with countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America to restructure their domestic debt where necessary. We worked with the Nicaraguans back in the days of HIPC to do that. And it's important to note that domestic debt includes lots of different types of instruments. I think these were mentioned before, but I'm thinking here of short-term debt, which is short-term we would call treasury bills in an English-speaking system, which are used for monetary control or for filling temporary fiscal gaps. Longer-term bonds, which are supposed to finance the budget and particularly long-term investment projects. You might also have in some countries arrears to all sorts of types of people who've provided services to the government, but also to pension funds. Sometimes the government has a big overhang of money it hasn't managed to pay to the public pension fund, for example. And sometimes governments borrow from the central bank domestically as well. When we all started, and we were involved, particularly in Francophone Africa, which didn't have these types of markets 20 years ago, we were involved in helping establish these types of markets. We all learned that in theory, the best practice of using domestic debt is to use the short-term debt only on a temporary basis to finance temporary gaps, treasury gaps, if you like, cash flow gaps in the budget. And you shouldn't be depending on that short-term debt for any serious amount of budget financing beyond the end of each financial year. Then the second part was to use the long-term debt to finance longer-term investments, so projects that were very important in the budget that would have a big return, and where you could say, we're going to spend this money on projects which justify the cost of issuing that long-term debt. And thirdly, to avoid arrears and avoid taking overdrafts from the central bank. For various reasons, that's not seen as a very good idea. Now, the problem has been since then that on the side of the governments who are doing the borrowing, they have had very high financing needs, particularly since we all set ambitious goals for the SDGs and for national development plans. And at the same time, they have had a real lack of any type of financing, of external financing, which comes with reasonable costs. And I'm not even talking there about the risks, which people mentioned before, of devaluation and so on. So in this situation, they've had to turn to domestic debt. But at the same time, you've also had the main creditors of the domestic debt being the financial sector. And what's happened is, because the government has such high needs, it pays high interest rates to make sure that people buy the domestic debt, and the financial sector becomes very dependent on the profits it's making from domestic debt and stops investing in the real economy. Some would say it probably wouldn't have anyway, but we can have that separate debate later. And also, the other main investors have been pension funds, which in many cases have been either, how can I put it, financialized or privatized. In other words, they're there to make a profit, and therefore they want to also look at short-term profit more than long-term investment. And so you need to see this in the context of the bigger financialization of the global economy and the way that we've transformed public goods into financialized private sector goods. And what this combination of these two factors has done is to create very distorted markets with very high interest rates. And we shouldn't forget, for those of us, and in our organization at DFI, the other half of our organization works on inequality issues. We care a lot about inequality within countries. We shouldn't forget that most of the creditors, particularly the financial institutions and individuals who buy domestic debt, are relatively rich in the countries. And they are getting a very high return from interest rates, which are quite often very far above inflation. Whereas, on the other hand, when it comes to cutting the spending as a result of the high domestic debt burden, it is the poorest people in the country who suffer if those cuts are of the social spending. So, in a sense, this whole structure is exacerbating inequality in countries. So, what can we do in that context? Well, first of all, as has already been referred to several times, we must include the service of domestic debt in the analyses of debt sustainability. We've just finished a report for Friedrich Ebert Stiftung and Jubilee USA, which looks at this. And it's already done in the LIC DSF, the Debt Sustainability Framework for Low-Income Countries, which applies to 70 countries in the world. But it's not done for the DSF for Market Accessing Countries, MACs, which is used in virtually all of the Latin American countries these days. And it really must be included. Now, the other thing that we think is really important is that we need to really emphasize and underline the needs for spending more on the SDGs and the objectives in countries' national development plans. Particularly post-COVID, it looks like we're going to miss those by miles. So it's very important that we make the maximum effort to reach them. And therefore, we think it's important that we should be monitoring the ratios between the debt service and social spending and environmental spending, which will together confront the crises of inequality, the climate crisis, and also the biodiversity crisis, which we see in terms of deforestation so much in Latin America and in terms of the blue economy in the Caribbean. And the one thing that occurs to us that could be done, which has been done with quite a lot of success across the world, is actually not to issue instruments of domestic debt with floating market-determined interest rates, but issue them with fixed interest rates above inflation, so that people aren't losing money, but only by about 1 or 2%, and if necessary, guarantees of regional or international institutions to bring down the interest rates. And this has worked very successfully in lots of countries, Ethiopia, Rwanda, and so on, without causing what some people would call financial repression and messing up the financial system more. Then what can we do for the countries which are already in crisis? Well, it's very important to analyze the impact of the domestic debt restructuring on increasing fiscal space for spending more on the SDGs. We already heard from Sri Lanka and from Argentina how complicated this is and how you need to really take account of the context of the different instruments and creditors. In some countries, it's possible to refinance the existing domestic debt burden by replacing it with bonds which have lower interest rates, as I just discussed in the previous slide, to reduce the service. But in others, there will have to be a reduction of domestic debt with the same types of mechanisms used for external debt. And as I said, you need to look very carefully through the different instruments and creditors and the impact on not just the economy, but the society. So yes, it is absolutely clear that in many countries there will need to be either less reduction or total exclusion of public pension funds. And maybe the central bank can provide more reduction. Often the central bank is in quite a good financial position and can actually afford to replace whatever debt is owed to it with what they call a zero interest perpetual bond, which basically means you never need to repay anything, which goes in its accounts to show that it has a good set of assets, but it doesn't need to be repaid. And then the mechanism used most often is to replace existing bonds with a much longer term. In other words, you cancel the existing bonds and you issue to the creditors longer term bonds, a bit like was done with the external debt with Brady bonds. And you do those also with fixed interest rates. Some countries have used across the world IMF special drawing rights to achieve this. Some countries have used in revenues that they're getting from privatizations, and some countries have used sort of external budget support aid for this type of financing these type of operations. And there are many examples across lots of continents, from Cape Verde, from Indonesia, from Nicaragua, most recently from Ghana, where they've done restructuring very successfully. In Ghana's case, for example, they had a much lower percentage reduction for the pension funds. And this has worked very successfully and has not just avoided problems for the domestic financial markets, but actually reinforced them. Because very like the external creditors, when you improve the sustainability of your debt by giving it a profile which is more repayable, everybody is happier about the future sustainability of your debt in your country. So overall conclusions, finally, I think it's very important that we, as was signaled in Daniela's presentation as well, to say that the debt crisis is back in Latin America, unfortunately, in a different way. A big crisis, part of this crisis in Latin America and other regions of the global south is internal debt service, domestic debt service. We must take measures to stop there being a crisis in quite a few countries by reducing the cost of the debt. In many more countries, it's probably necessary to have measures which refinance or restructure the domestic debt. And you can see across the world from multiple experiences that this is possible with positive results for the government in terms of fiscal space and positive results for the creditors of domestic debt in the longer term. And I think it's very important to remember that, at least from our perspective at DFI, these measures are essential to be taken so that we can all spend more on fighting the global inequality and environmental crises and making sure that we don't have all the political problems that were referred to in Maia's presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Matthew, for this analysis, for all these recommendations, and also recommendations learned in different processes that have taken place in different regions for over a long time. Well, I've been a terrible moderator because we only have 4 minutes. So plus the presentations were very interesting. So I think, I'd like to thank all panelists. I didn't want to cut any presentation because you've shared really, really important information, very rich, very exhaustive. I think It leaves us all with lots of content to follow. We have some questions, so I would ask for 5 more minutes of your time to be able to give 2 minutes to each panelist to be able to give us their comments. You've seen some heard people. I don't know. Maybe you have other reactions, and also to answer questions. So I am going to give panelists some information. If anybody, and we've also received questions because we have a live session. So we have received questions through other means. And the question for Daniela is, what is the situation in Peru? Why don't we see Peru in the data and statistics? But at the same time, Daniela, if you have any message, any closing message from the position of civil society with regard to domestic debt. Thank you, Patricia. Well, answering your question, when we include the regional outlook we do include Peru, but it's not a case study in the report, mainly because maybe Peru doesn't have a large debt problem right now. Domestic debt was important in Peru, but over the last few years, its foreign debt has taken more relevance. We also need to take into consideration that Peru has fiscal laws. One of them is to limit public debt to 30% of GDP in general. Now, this has been made more flexible during the pandemic. They've exceeded it by a few percentage points, but the commitment from the government to the next 3 to 5 years is to return to the previous level. Now, as far as debt maintenance, it's true that Peru is not there due to being able to compare data, but in a previous study, we have that data where maintaining domestic debt is higher. It's not as significant as we had shown it in the report. The relationship is roughly 55% of maintenance expenses are for domestic debt, an average over the last 5 years. And something that I wanted to also mention about Peru that could be used to close, because I know I have very little time, is that in the case of Peru, and we've included this in the report as a note, issuance of domestic debt has to be approved by Congress, and it has to have a specific aim, meaning that it needs to be followed up on with regard to what use was given to those resources. So this may also serve to see if it would be possible to apply this in the context of other countries in the region. So I would like to highlight that is in the report with regard to Peru, and that has to do with transparency, which I think we've mentioned for all panelists. So just to close with that, and I think it's one of the important issues, not just for internal debt, but also in general for public debt and how it's managed. I'll close with that. Thank you, Daniela. Maia, what are the challenges for Argentina as far as issuing domestic debt in the current context of high inflation? And we also have another question on what have been the main differences identified at that time with regard to analyzing sustainability of the debt carried out by Argentina. That it's worth mentioning that it was able to do its own DFD with vis-a-vis the original sustaining. What were the main divergences in your closing words? Well, thank you very much for the questions. Very interesting presentations, and I think it's created a good debate with needs for continuity, because there's a lot to discuss on this topic. So I think that's been very useful. Now, with regard to inflation and to issuance of debt, it's important to distinguish that, say, when since 2019, when we began with this restructuring process for debt, and access to capital, there was lots of imbalance, and one of the big policies that we carried out was to rebuild a solid domestic capitals market with a much more adequate curve for financing and maturity, and the sense of being able to raise and lower rates. So using financing in this context for Argentina is important for development and to have solid capital. Obviously, the country had the challenge of financing through monetary policy, which was one of the issues that needed to be debated on inflation. So it's also a decision as far as policies, not just about Argentina not having a capitals market, but also in the sense of COVID and the war in Ukraine that left fewer sources of financing for the country. As far as DSA, what's important here to highlight is the capacity of the country to create a sustainability analysis, and the fact that the IMF was able to carry out sustainability analysis outside the program. Normally, the IMF analyzes DSAs within Article 4 or in the context of a program. For Argentina, and this was debated jointly with private creditors to have an IMF DSA outside the program. It helped, like it was part of an important process with negotiating with private creditors as far as this debate over recovery value and what difference there is in recovery risk, because creditors often tell you, okay, well, there's I'm going to be very honest here, right? Like, so many of lots of the discussion that has to do with solvency versus liquidity. This happened to Sri Lanka as well. So when you have the IMF, Argentina even showing you the parameters of a debt that is not sustainable, that has to be restructured, that needs to have other profiles, it's been very important in our discussions and negotiations. And I think it's something important to take into account by other countries, both doing it through one's own means and being able to have a capability that's important for managing the debt, as well as being able to understand that the IMF is capable of doing a DSA in the program to be able to have a debate to discuss, because the IMF, when it does it in the context of a program, it also has a particular bias, given that the IMF can't lend by their own policy to a country that doesn't have sustainable debt. So you get some feedback mechanisms, but that's for a separate debate on the IMF that we can have in a different context. So thank you very much for the invitation. The report is also very valuable. The discussion and all the panelists, we have learned a lot, and thank you very much to everybody for your presentations and for the invitation. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Maia, for sharing your experience also. Ahilan.
From what we have heard, the debt problem and its impacts of the debt restructuring in Sri Lanka are really far from being resolved. What are your main messages in this case for Sri Lanka, but also that could be used and for the other civil society organizations, other stakeholders, academia that follow the debt issue, and what are the main needs? What do we need to call for in this case?
Thank you. And I think there needs to be a much longer debate on many of the themes that were brought here. But I will just make 2 points. One, if we are serious about global inequality, let's look at what's happening with commercial lending. When interest rates in the West were close to 0%, Sri Lanka was borrowing at 7-8% from the bondholders. That's the main reason for inequality. Before we start going into talking about how domestic debt creates inequality, it is this international inequality. And the IMF and the World Bank and their programs, when they come to Sri Lanka, are reinforcing that. After this domestic debt restructuring, the end goal of the 4-year IMF program is to return to the capital markets. When they decide to push for domestic debt restructuring in Sri Lanka, it takes away the sovereign capacity of a country to develop itself. right? They want to collapse the external debt and the domestic debt, and to reduce the possibility of any kind of deficit financing, even if there is a shock, by trying to collapse both of these into one. So, there are two big questions here. If you're serious about global inequality, which I think there needs to be a lot of solidarity in the global South about how we are going to deal with the global North and the global capital markets, right? Do we want to keep going back at this high? So why can Japan have 200, 300% of domestic debt? Because of this global inequality. But the focus is on the global South countries so that we are taken away the possibility to be able to develop our countries. And this has been the history of colonialism, and this is the history of neocolonialism. So this is something that all of us have to think seriously about. Thank you.
Thanks, Ahilan, for also including a more deep analysis and questions about the origin of debt and inequalities between the global North and the global South.
I'll let Matthew Martin give the final words. Matthew, a message for different stakeholders, the message for countries in the global South, another message for creditors from the North with regard to domestic debt, and any message or recommendation for those who are analyzing these topics, such as the IMF and other financial organizations.
Okay, thank you, Patty. Can I just start with a message to you for having organized this? Thank you so much. It's so nice also to be on a panel which is more than gender balanced and entirely composed of people from the global South. So it's really good to be to see that, because very often this debt is a very male-dominated subject, and lots of panelists are from the global North. Let me also just have a quick message for Eswatini, because I saw somebody in the chat saying they were on the call from Eswatini, which is fantastic to see someone from a completely different region. Debt is a huge problem for Eswatini, and 80% of that problem is domestic debt. Definitely a major issue for Eswatini going forward, I think. On the message for the international community, I completely agree with Ahilan that we really have to have a focus on yes, you can call it neocolonialism, why not? And on the imbalance, if you like, this sort of risk perception that there is in global financial markets, which allow northern countries to borrow currently at somewhere around 4 or 5%, and force southern countries to borrow internationally at anything upwards of 10 to 15%. And that is completely unsustainable. And I've worked a lot with people in Africa talking about the fact that the risk premium on African debt is completely ridiculous and should be ended. But it does seem to me that the best way to do that is for the regional organizations and international organizations, which are supposed to be helping the countries, rather than putting their money into ridiculous financial schemes like public-private partnerships, could they perhaps do a lot more of guaranteeing of global government bonds, so that then those global South countries can actually issue debt at the same kind of risk premium that Japan and Britain issue debt at the moment? It would be one of the simplest ways to do that. But I also think it's really important, given the context. So we all know we're in a context at the moment where even if there is a worse debt crisis than there has ever been across the world, people are not prepared to do very much about it. One, I think, glimmer of hope is from the review of the LIC DSF and eventually the MAC DSF, which is taking place in Washington at the moment, where it does look like the IMF will bring in the issues of how much countries need to spend on the climate. But they don't really seem to be bringing in the positive effects that the spending on climate and fighting inequality could have on accelerating growth in countries. And therefore, the effect of that review, if all they do is bring in the extra costs, will just be to stop countries borrowing anything, anywhere, domestic or external. And we have to push back against that. We have to say, you must put into that the positive effects of the borrowing on growth. And also that you must put a much more prominent role, as Daniela said, on the service of domestic debt and compared to external debt, and on the total debt service in all your analysis. Because at the moment, yes, it's included in the numbers, but they tend to ignore it when they make the decision about whether a country's debt is sustainable or not. And then finally, I do think it's really important that the countries do things for themselves. So I don't think the IMF is going to end up with the model of DSAs that we like. And therefore, it's really important that the countries do their own DSAs, as I know you did in Argentina, Maya, and bring in the factors that are really important to them, whether it be, differential treatment for domestic debt or whatever. But also, I do think very important point, which Daniela sort of skipped over in her presentation, there is a fundamental lack of accountability for domestic debt policy in most countries because parliaments just approve a ceiling for the total domestic debt borrowing. They don't really think at all about the cost of that, the interest rates, the maturities, and so on. And I think it's really important as we go forward that there's a massive effort across the world to build accountability of governments for what they are doing on domestic debt so that we don't get into the mess in future and so that parliaments and civil society can hold them accountable. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you to the panelists and participants who registered. We would like to hold on to being able to include domestic debt as part of total debt. It's important what impact they have, who the chief actors are, and now we understand better why even the financial community is also addressing domestic debt. We want to solve the problem of this debt in total with a more holistic view. Thank you very much to each of your panelists. We have many topics to discuss, and it will be interesting to be able to discuss it at some point. Like if it's going to be part of the analysis for sustainability, how is it going to be part of a more global focus for renegotiating the debt over a more global multilateral view? This allows us to continue having conversations. Thank you very much to everybody. We will be sharing presentations, recording, reporting to your emails. Greetings to all and have a great rest of the day.